Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a groundbreaking public policy analysis by Gayatri PG on extreme heat, and it reveals how a changing climate is fundamentally breaking our emergency response systems. Look, we all know what a really hot summer day feels like, right? But what happens when heat stops being just a temporary weather event and literally transforms into a chronic structural barrier to human survival? Well, that is exactly what we are going to unpack today. 380 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. This staggering figure represents India's informal workers, making up a massive 90% of the nation's workforce. We are talking about the farmers, the construction workers, the street vendors, and the gig economy drivers. As the policy paper highlights, these folks are existing at a truly dangerous intersection. They face incredibly high occupational exposure to extreme heat, but they have almost zero institutional protection. They are the ones bearing the brunt of a slow-moving, invisible disaster, practically carrying the weight of a warming world on their shoulders. So, here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The invisible structural crisis. 2. Human and economic toll. 3. Why current policies fail. 4. Root causes of inaction. And finally, 5. Redesigning heat governance. Let's dive right into part 1. The invisible structural crisis, a new normal. To truly grasp the magnitude of this problem, we've got to completely shift our mental model. We have to stop viewing heat as just a temporary seasonal hazard that you can simply wait out indoors. We need to recognize it as a persistent structural crisis. Historically, heat waves were treated as localized tragedies. Take 1998 in Odisha, for example, where over 2,500 lives were lost, or the 2010 Ahmedabad heat wave that claimed 1,300 lives. Now, those acute events definitely forced a change in public policy discourse back then. But look at where we are at present. What used to be isolated geographical emergencies has now evolved into a 3 to 4 month long nationwide ordeal. Over 57% of India's districts are now classified as heat-prone, and crucially, temperatures are staying much higher at night, too. This isn't just a hotter summer, folks. It is an entirely new climatic reality. Which brings us to part 2, human and economic toll, beyond the heat stroke. Now let's talk numbers, because the macroeconomic reality here is just mind-blowing. Extreme heat accounts for approximately $159 billion in lost productivity in India. To put that into perspective, that equates to roughly 5.4% of the national income, with over 160 billion work hours lost annually. And it's getting worse. By 2030, projections show India could lose nearly 6% of its daily working hours. This is quite literally an economic hemorrhage, completely disguised as a weather event. But we have to contrast that massive macro-level financial loss with the microbiology of an actual informal worker, someone who has to endure these severe, chronic, subclinical impacts without any kind of safety net. We're talking about the progressive degradation of renal systems and severe cardiovascular stress just from sustained exposure, even if it stays below the lethal heat stroke limit. The policy paper also shines a light on some heavily ignored psychosocial tolls, things like chronic sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and get this, a documented increase in gender-based violence during periods of extreme thermal discomfort. And if you are working in a city, it is a massive risk multiplier because of the urban heat island effect. Indian cities are actually warming nearly twice as fast as rural areas. The concrete, the asphalt, the sheer lack of green space, it all traps the heat long after the sun goes down, leaving urban centers anywhere from 4 to 7 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding areas. So we really have to ask ourselves, when the ambient outdoor temperature remains stubbornly high deep into the night, how does a worker living in a highly dense, informal settlement ever physically recover for the next day of backbreaking labor? Well, the tragic reality is they don't. Millions of people live under uninsulated corrugated iron or asbestos roofs. These materials act as literal thermal traps. They can make indoor environments 5 to 10 degrees hotter than it already is outside. This entirely robs workers of that overnight cooling window their bodies so desperately need for a physiological reset. It leads to this chronic fatigue that just progressively destroys their health over time. Let's move to part 3. Why current policies fail, the illusion of protection. Okay, so if temperatures are rising, human bodies are failing, and billions of dollars are being lost, why on earth are our current heat action plans, or HAPs, falling so short? The crucial point the analysis makes here is this policy illusion. We are trying to solve a structural welfare crisis using an obsolete short-term disaster relief paradigm.
Think about it. When heat is framed strictly as a disaster, success is measured purely by keeping the death toll low. It's entirely reactive. A welfare governance approach, on the other hand, actually acknowledges the structural drivers, like housing, urban planning, and labor laws, and focuses proactively on morbidity and economic security over the long haul.
This quote from the paper hits the nail on the head and perfectly captures the frustration. The current public policy discourse typically follows a cycle of alarm and amnesia. Right? As soon as the summer ends, the entire crisis is completely forgotten until next year. This creates a massive last-mile implementation gap. Generic public health advisories telling people to stay indoors and hydrate mean absolutely nothing to a street vendor or a construction worker who simply cannot afford to take a break without losing their daily wage.
And there is a major fiscal constraint at play here, too. Currently, heat waves are not legally classified as notified disasters at the national level in India. Because of this loophole, state governments are legally restricted to spending a maximum of only 10% of their state disaster response fund on heat relief. This artificial financial ceiling forces cities to rely on short-term patchwork projects, like temporary water kiosks, rather than actually investing in crucial long-term structural protections like thermal retrofitting or green urban infrastructure.
This brings us to part 4, root causes of inaction, the political economy. So why is this so incredibly hard to fix? And why does this cycle of systemic neglect persist year after year? Well, unlike a catastrophic flood or an earthquake, heat is a silent disaster. It doesn't leave behind any dramatic physical debris for the evening news cameras. Furthermore, heat deaths are socially invisible. They often happen completely outside of clinical settings and are frequently misattributed to pre-existing conditions, which makes the statistics highly contested. And this invisibility, it allows commercial interests, like those in construction or manufacturing, to externalize the risks of thermal stress entirely onto marginalized workers who largely lack the electoral mobilization to demand better protections. And check out the direct economic punishment these workers endure. The data shows that for every single 1 degree Celsius increase in wet bulb temperature, there is an associated 19% decline in net earnings for informal workers. 19%, because their bodies physically have to slow down just to prevent collapsing, their output naturally drops. A worker shouldn't ever have to choose between physiological survival and feeding their family, yet they are absorbing these massive wage penalties without a single safety net or compensation mechanism in sight. To make matters even worse, recent legislative shifts have arguably weakened protections. The Occupational Safety, Health, and Working Conditions Code, or OSHW, has been heavily criticized by groups like the Amazon India Workers Union. Why? Because it actually replaced strict statutory mandates from older factory laws, which explicitly govern things like indoor temperature limits, with much more ambiguous discretionary rules. Plus, it leaves gig and platform workers completely outside its physical workplace protections, which is a massive legislative oversight in today's economy. All right, let's wrap up with solutions in Part 5, Redesigning Heat Governance, a New Blueprint. We absolutely can no longer rely on passive seasonal disaster management. We need a proactive blueprint that treats heat protection as a year-round priority. First, we have to shift from weak advisory labor codes to actual rights-based protection, recognizing safety from extreme climate as a fundamental right to life under Article 21. Second, we need a specialized cabinet-level framework that seamlessly integrates health, labor, and urban planning. Third, states must start partnering with the private sector to fund long-horizon thermal retrofitting and urban green spaces. And fourth, we've got to leverage civil society to design solutions like parametric insurance that actually reflect the real, on-the-ground realities of varied informal workers. Ultimately, the policy response requires a massive paradigm shift. Safety from extreme heat can no longer be treated as a private luxury that you only get to enjoy if you have the purchasing power to afford an air conditioner. The state must guarantee cooling as a fundamental, mandatory public service infrastructure. Literally, exactly the same way we view access to clean drinking water or basic sanitation. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. The impact of heat waves on informal workers is a true existential challenge. To build a resilient and just economy, we have to decide right now. In a rapidly warming world, is survival just a privilege for the few who can buy their way out of the heat? Or is it a fundamental human right for us all? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Definitely think about that the next time the temperature starts to rise. And keep asking the hard questions.